So if you believe that, the fact that you can say, well, this has a history and that has a tradition, doesn't much go to the rationale that you are asking this court to accept. So once you're down this road, it's a little bit hard to see how you stop. And I think that that's one question. I mean, there's another question about whether you should start at all. But one question is, if you accept that proposition, which is the fundamental proposition of your brief, it does not seem as though there's a stopping point.
Yeah, I think it's a proposition of our brief, but those are obviously quotes from these courts' opinions. So it isn't that we have gone down this road. I think the court has been down this road. The country has been down this road since the decision of 1789. Again, Ex parte Hennon describes this as settled beyond doubt. Again, Parsons, which anticipates all the analysis of Myers, says the very same thing. This is beyond question.
You hear the words and they chill you to your marrow, because Justice Elena Kagan has just articulated what those of us who study the architecture of authoritarianism have been screaming into the void for months, for years, and what you just witnessed in that exchange is the precise moment when the theoretical becomes terrifyingly concrete, when the abstract danger of unrestrained executive power crystallizes into something so visceral and so immediate that you can almost taste the ash of democracy burning. Listen to her probing, listen to her dissecting the argument with surgical precision, asking the fundamental question that should haunt every American lying awake tonight: where does it stop? Because what Trump's lawyer just told the Supreme Court, what he baldly asserted without shame or hesitation, is that there is no stopping point, that the road America embarked upon in some mythical 1789 leads inevitably to a presidency unconstrained by law, unbound by constitutional limits, answerable to no power on earth save the whims of the executive himself. And here is what should make your blood run cold, and your hands shake as you clutch whatever tether to sanity remains in this hallucinogenic nightmare we inhabit. The Supreme Court determined that presidential immunity from criminal prosecution presumptively extends to all of a president's official acts, with absolute immunity for official acts within an exclusive presidential authority that Congress cannot regulate, such as the pardon, command of the military, execution of laws, or control of the executive branch. And this decision didn't emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a court that has spent years methodically constructing the scaffolding for autocracy, and now Trump stands ready to walk through the door they've opened. The clip you just heard is more than legal argument. It's the sound of constitutional guardrails being dismantled in real time, because when Kagan warns about the absence of stopping points, she's engaging with Trump's attorney, who argued that if the president told generals to stage a coup, it could well be an official act. And let that sink into your consciousness for one horrifying moment. Let the full weight of that assertion press down on you until you understand what's at stake. In response to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, Trump's lawyer averred that a president's ordering the assassination of a rival could be an official act, and in response to Justice Elena Kagan, he said that a president's ordering a military coup to prolong his term of office might also be an official act. These are not hypotheticals designed to test the outer boundaries of reasonable legal theory. These are revelations of the authoritarian logic that animates this entire project, this entire crusade to place one man above the law, beyond accountability, immune from consequences no matter how monstrous his actions. And you need to understand something crucial that the media's both sides equivocation obscures, and that liberal hand-wringing often fails to articulate with sufficient force. The court's 6-3 majority freed presidents to use their official powers to engage in criminal acts substantially free of accountability, which means we're no longer debating abstract constitutional principles or engaging in the kind of academic exercise that law school professors might assign to first-year students. Justice Sonia Sotomayor said in a passionate dissent that the majority gives President Trump all he asks for and more, and that whether described as presumptive or absolute, under the majority's rule, a president's use of any official power for any purpose, even the most corrupt, is immune from prosecution. Read those words again. Let them echo in the chambers of your conscience. Even the most corrupt purpose is now shielded, and this isn't hyperbole, this isn't progressive fear-mongering, this is the plain meaning of what the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority has wrought. Because here's what keeps me up at night, and what should terrify every person who values the possibility of self-governance and human dignity. By inserting this opinion into a world where impeachment is no longer a viable option, the Supreme Court is licensing future presidents to subvert our democracy at will, and protecting a past president, Donald Trump, who attempted just that. The mechanics of tyranny are being assembled before our eyes, with the efficiency and methodical precision of engineers constructing a machine designed specifically to crush dissent, And the unitary executive theory that Trump's lawyers invoke isn't some dusty originalist interpretation that serious constitutional scholars embrace. It's a theory that critics say could lead to more corruption and less qualified employees, and some critics point to countries where similar changes to a more unitary executive have resulted in democratic backsliding. We have the receipts, we have the evidence from Hungary, from Turkey, from Venezuela, from every nation that watched strongman executives dismantle institutional independence and consolidate power until elections became theatrical performances rather than meaningful democratic exercises. And the truly chilling revelation, the bombshell that should detonate across every consciousness still tethered to the possibility of justice, is that Stephen Levitsky, a professor of government at Harvard and co-author of How Democracies Die, says we've slid into some form of authoritarianism and that it is relatively mild compared to some others. It is certainly reversible, but we are no longer living in a liberal democracy. Those words come not from activists or partisan operatives, but from scholars who have devoted their professional lives to studying how democracies collapse, how they fail, how they transform into something unrecognizable. A survey of more than 500 political scientists finds that the vast majority think the United States is moving swiftly from liberal democracy toward some form of authoritarianism, and these are the experts. These are the people who understand the patterns, who recognize the warning signs, who can read the historical echoes reverberating through our current moment. The Supreme Court decision in July wasn't just about Trump's specific case, wasn't just about whether he could be prosecuted for attempting to overturn an election and incite an insurrection. It was about fundamentally rewriting the relationship between power and accountability in American governance. Justice Sotomayor wrote that never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe that he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law, and that moving forward, however, all former presidents will be cloaked in such immunity. Think about the precedent being established here. Think about what this means, not just for Trump but for every president who follows, for every executive who now understands that the official powers of the presidency can be wielded as weapons against democracy itself with impunity. Based on the majority opinion, a president would have absolute immunity to sell pardons, accept bribes in exchange for vetoing a piece of legislation, poison their own attorney general, obstruct the Department of Justice from carrying out investigations of allies, or direct the DOJ to go after political opponents. Let me say that again because the horror of it cannot be overstated. A sitting president could, according to this ruling, have at least the presumption of immunity, if not absolute immunity, for assassinating political rivals and deploying a military coup to stay in power. This is not a democracy. This is not a republic. This is a permission structure for dictatorship, and the fact that the Supreme Court dressed it up in the language of constitutional interpretation and separation of powers doesn't make it any less catastrophic. The Supreme Court's reactionary 6-member majority ruled that the president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for acts relating to core constitutional duties and theft, plunder, embezzlement, extortion, abduction, assassination, or attempted election interference or a coup could now shield presidents from criminal prosecution, and Trump isn't waiting. He's not treating this as theoretical, because Trump and his supporters laid the groundwork for over a decade, repeatedly making false claims of national and social crises, and by weaponizing fear, inventing crises, and redefining enemies, Trump has laid the rhetorical groundwork for sweeping executive actions that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. The authoritarian playbook is being executed with stunning efficiency, and retribution is the dominant theme of Trump's 2024 campaign, and his allies are making plans to eliminate the Department of Justice's traditional prosecutorial independence to give Trump greater personal control to direct law enforcement against his perceived opponents and insulate himself from accountability. Read that sentence slowly. Let each word land with its full weight. Eliminating prosecutorial independence means weaponizing the justice system, means transforming law enforcement from a neutral arbiter into an instrument of political persecution. The scholars and legal experts aren't being alarmist, they're being precise, because Trump ran an openly authoritarian campaign in 2024, pledging to prosecute his rivals, punish critical media, and deploy the army to repress protest, and he won, and thanks to an extraordinary Supreme Court decision, he will enjoy broad presidential immunity during his second term. Democracy didn't die in darkness, it's being killed in broad daylight while cameras roll, and journalists report and citizens watch, and the question Kagan posed in that oral argument about whether there's a stopping point gets answered every single day in the accumulating evidence of democratic erosion. President Donald Trump is smashing constitutional and legal guardrails to build an authoritarian presidency that cements his political power and ultimately harms Americans, and this unconstitutional effort to effectively turn the presidency into an unaccountable autocracy has taken the United States to the brink of authoritarianism. Think about what we've witnessed in just the opening months of Trump's second term. Think about the cascade of norm violations that would have been unimaginable scandals a decade ago, but now barely register as headlines. Trump fires at least 17 inspectors general, whose mission is to ferret out waste, fraud, and abuse, and the Office of Management and Budget issues a memo pausing all federal funding, putting as much as $3 trillion of federal financial assistance in limbo, including money that pays for essential services like Medicaid, Head Start, and unemployment insurance. These aren't policy disagreements. These are attacks on the institutional architecture that makes accountability possible, that creates the possibility of checks on executive power, that preserves some minimal space for democratic governance. And the unitary executive theory that Trump's lawyers champion in that courtroom exchange isn't a neutral constitutional interpretation. It's an ideological project designed specifically to concentrate power, because the unitary executive theory has always been a dangerous idea, given the risk of presidential overreach and abuse of power, and a more muscular version asserts that the president may even depart from the law in some circumstances usually related to national security, a version most famously summarized by former President Richard Nixon saying, "When the president does it, that means it is not illegal. By definition." We've heard this song before. We know how this story ends, and the Supreme Court just gave Trump and every future president the constitutional blessing to sing it again. The legal edifice being constructed isn't about protecting presidential authority in the abstract sense that might appeal to principled originalists worried about maintaining separation of powers. It's about shielding Trump specifically from accountability for specific crimes. The Supreme Court's ruling may let a former president off the hook for his flagrantly anti-democratic behavior, as Trump is accused of attempting to overturn the 2020 election, essentially anointing himself by invalidating the choices of millions of voters, and the court's ruling complicates the case against him considerably. This is the telos, the endpoint, the ultimate purpose of this entire legal strategy, to ensure that Trump can never be held accountable, that his attempted coup remains unpunished, that the precedent becomes established that presidents can try to overthrow democracy and face no consequences. And here's what makes this moment so urgent and so terrifying, beyond even the immediate threat Trump poses. Competitive authoritarianism will transform political life in the United States, and as Trump's early flurry of dubiously constitutional executive orders made clear, the cost of public opposition will rise considerably, with Democratic Party donors potentially targeted by the IRS, businesses that fund civil rights groups facing heightened tax and legal scrutiny. We're watching in real time the construction of a system where formal democratic institutions remain but are hollowed out, weaponized, turned into instruments of repression rather than vehicles for collective self-determination. Under competitive authoritarianism, the system is not democratic, because incumbents rig the game by deploying the machinery of government to attack opponents and co-opt critics. The constitutional crisis isn't coming. It's here. It's happening. It's unfolding with every executive order, every fired inspector general, every threat against critical media, every assertion of unlimited presidential power. Justice Elena Kagan noted that the framers of the Constitution consciously did not put in an explicit presidential immunity clause, and she said they were reacting to a monarch who claimed to be against the law, asking, wasn't the whole point that the president was not a monarch, and the president was not supposed to be above the law? That question hangs in the air unanswered, because the court's conservative majority has decided, in direct contradiction to the founders' explicit rejection of monarchical power, to create a president who is functionally above the law, who can commit crimes with the full authority of the office, and face no criminal consequences. And you heard Trump's lawyer in that clip invoking history, citing cases from 1789, wrapping his argument for unlimited executive power in the rhetoric of originalism and tradition. But the majority of the justices claim the court's ruling restores the founders' designs for an energetic executive, but this distorts the founders' understanding of executive power in our constitutional democracy, as the founders determined that presidents would have no criminal immunity so they could be prosecuted if they violated the law. The historical record is clear. The founding generation understood that unchecked executive power was tyranny, that accountability was essential, that no person could be above the law without transforming republic into monarchy. But the Supreme Court has rewritten that history, has invented a constitutional principle that the founders explicitly rejected, has given Trump exactly what he asked for and more. So when you hear Justice Kagan asking about stopping points, when you hear her pressing Trump's lawyer on the logical implications of his theory, When you hear her expressing concern that once you're down this road it becomes impossible to find an exit, understand that she's articulating the precise mechanism by which democracies die. They don't usually collapse in military coups or sudden revolutions. They erode gradually through the accumulation of precedents, through the normalization of abnormality, through the acceptance of each new transgression, until what was once unthinkable becomes routine. Authoritarians around the world have popularized the use of salami tactics, slicing away at democracy one piece at a time as a way to cement their power and erode guardrails incrementally. And because this happens gradually, it is easy to forget the anti-democratic actions of a week, month, or year ago, and as a result, something that might have been considered beyond the pale a few years prior eventually becomes normalized. The moment demands not hand-wringing or both sides' equivocation, but moral clarity and collective resistance, because the institutions we thought would protect us have failed. The guardrails we believed were sturdy have crumbled. The courts we imagined would defend constitutional principles have instead become vehicles for consolidating authoritarian power. With Republicans controlling both houses, Congress is unlikely to provide a check on Trump's power. Other institutions are also likely to be less effective at stopping him this time around. His own cabinet members will be loyalists, who will never provide resistance, and with a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, the judiciary is also unlikely to provide a substantial check on his power. The system is failing, not because Americans didn't design it well enough, not because the founders lacked wisdom, but because bad faith actors are exploiting every vulnerability, testing every limit, and finding that the mechanisms we thought would stop them are unable or unwilling to function. This is the inflection point. This is the hinge of history. This is the moment when we either mount serious organized resistance to the authoritarian project being implemented with stunning speed and efficiency, or we watch passively as American democracy transforms into something unrecognizable, something our grandchildren will study in history books wondering how we let it happen. The clip you heard isn't just a legal argument about presidential immunity. It's a warning signal. It's an alarm bell. It's Justice Kagan using every tool at her disposal to make visible the catastrophe unfolding in real time. She's telling us that there is no stopping point, that the logic of unlimited executive power leads inexorably toward tyranny, that once you accept the premise that presidents can commit crimes in their official capacity without facing consequences, you've abandoned the core principle that distinguishes republic from autocracy. And Trump stands ready to test every boundary, to push every limit, to exploit every opening that the Supreme Court has created, because if civil society does not challenge the false narratives that frame repression as rescue, there is a risk that the executive orders will create the very real crises, a real democratic and social breakdown born not of migrant invasions or internal enemies, but of unchecked authoritarian power. The manufactured crises, the invented enemies, the constant drumbeat of fear and resentment are not bugs in the authoritarian system. They're features. They're the necessary preconditions for consolidating power and justifying increasingly extreme measures. Every autocrat needs enemies to demonize, threats to magnify, crises to weaponize, and Trump has shown himself to be a master of this dark art. So listen again to that exchange. Listen to Kagan probing. Listen to Trump's lawyer obfuscating. Listen to the architecture of authoritarianism being debated in the highest court in the land, and understand that what's at stake isn't just Trump's personal legal jeopardy, or even his political future. What's at stake is the entire project of democratic self-governance, the possibility that ordinary people can participate meaningfully in decisions that affect their lives, the hope that power can be constrained by law and held accountable through institutions. Many constitutional scholars had expected a split decision, but few anticipated such a big win for Trump, and for executive power. But a law professor said, "I just don't think anyone imagined that they would draw the line in a way that so clearly put a thumb on the scale for a president, and for this particular former president." The Supreme Court didn't just rule in Trump's favor. They rewrote the constitutional order to ensure he could never face accountability, and in doing so they created a presidency more powerful and less constrained than anything the founders imagined or intended. This isn't interpretation, it's invention. It's the construction of a new constitutional regime where presidents enjoy monarchical immunity while wielding extraordinary power, and Trump will use it. He's already using it. He's already firing inspectors general and threatening rivals and consolidating control over independent agencies. And the stopping point that Kagan asks about doesn't exist, because the logic of the unitary executive theory combined with absolute presidential immunity creates a closed system where power perpetually expands and accountability perpetually shrinks. We stand at the precipice, and the choice before us is stark: organize, resist, fight back with every tool available, every institution still standing, every space where democratic practice remains possible, or accept that the American experiment in self-governance has reached its terminus, that the Republic has given way to something else, something darker, something that wears the skin of democracy while hollowing out its substance. The scholars are warning us, the historians are warning us, the legal experts are warning us, and now Justice Kagan in her dissent and her questioning is warning us with every word that the stopping point doesn't exist, that we've entered a constitutional wilderness where the only limits on presidential power are the president's own discretion and moral character. And if we've learned anything from Trump, it's that those are no limits at all.